Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 2,500-year anniversary of the Battle of Thermopylae and the Battle of Salamis Commemoration panel discussion. This event is being hosted by EMBCA, the East Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance, in association with the Order of AHEPA, and AHEPA's Hellenic Cultural Commission, and AHEPA Empire District 6. My name is Lou Katsos, and I'm the president of EMBCA and the chairman of the Hellenic Cultural Commission and governor of District 6. Today, our panel discussion will focus on two of the most pivotal and important battles in Western civilization. Both involved the second Persian invasion of Greece, this one by King Xerxes, with the Battle of Thermopylae and Artemisium taking place in late August, early September, and the Battle of Salamis in late September in 480 B.C.E. The Battle of Thermopylae was a loss, but has remained through the ages a cultural icon of Western civilization since it was fought, with the battle revisited in countless works of popular culture and in many books on the theory and practice of warfare. The other, the Battle of Salamis, a naval battle, was a decisive victory and marked the turning point of the Helleno-Persian Wars, which was finalized with the battles of Plataea and Mycale. We are honored and privileged today to have as our panel moderator, Professor Joel Allen, the executive officer of the PhD program in history of the Graduate Center, and also a Queens College professor of classics, as well as being honored to have our highly distinguished panelists for this unique historical discussion. The mayor of Sparta, Petros Doukas, Professor Chris Carey, Emeritus Professor of Greek at University College London, Jennifer Roberts, a Professor of Classics at the Graduate Center, CUNY, and Professor Barry S. Strauss, the Bryce and Edith Bowmar Professor at Cornell University. Later in the discussion, and Petros is not on board yet. We don't know if he's having issues with the internet, but if he is on board later after the panel discussion, we will discuss what events are taking place in Sparta for the commemoration of the Battle of Thermopylae and also for the 200th anniversary of the Hellenic Revolution. Joel, who's a professor of history at Queens College and holds an appointment in the MA PhD program in classics at the Graduate Center. His research is in Roman imperial culture, and he is having a course this semester on the battles that we're going to be discussing today. His recent publication was The Roman Republic and the Hellenistic Mediterranean from Alexander to Caesar. Welcome, everyone. And Joel, welcome. And it's your panel. Thank you again, all of you, for partaking in this very historical event. Thank you all. Joel.
Thank you, Lou, for the introduction and for organizing this panel. The pandemic is an annoyance, of course, to put it mildly, but we're grateful that you and EMBCA is not letting this moment pass unnoticed or be postponed. The 2,500th year anniversary just isn't the same if you celebrate it in year 2,501, right? If there's a silver lining to the pandemic, and that's not easy to say, but if there is, it's that although we're forced to use Zoom, which is no substitute for being together in person, we're at least able to come together like this in real time across oceans and time zones at minimal expense. As I was emailing our speakers before this event, I was thinking, imagine what Leonidas and Themistocles would have done if they had access to Zoom, you know, or 10 years early at Marathon, why bother running to Marathon if you could just Zoom people and tell them the results? But so Lou has assembled a luminous panel of experts for us. Their interests range from the period in question, 480 BCE, and the Persian Wars of which the battles were a part, and the immediate aftermath in classical Greece, down to our current time, and how Thermopylae and Salamis continue to resonate in our culture today. So in accordance with the panelists' expertise, I thought we might proceed chronologically and discuss the battles themselves and then move through time, perhaps up to the 21st century. And famously, that is now 2,500 years later. So let me introduce everybody all at once, and then we can get started alphabetically. We have Chris Carey, as you know, who is Professor Emeritus of Classics from the University College London. His long and successful career also included stints at St. Andrews and Royal Holloway. He's the author of 9 books and commentaries, and editor or co-editor of 7 collections of essays, including a volume dedicated to the 2,500th anniversary of Marathon, which you guessed it, came in 2010. His commentaries deal with texts by everything from poets to orators, starting with Pindar and moving through Lysias, Demosthenes, Aeschines, and so on. His book, Democracy in Classical Athens, something of a classic, is now in a 2nd edition from Bloomsbury. And his current work on progress is a commentary for Cambridge University Press on Herodotus, Book 7, which is perfect timing for us, Book 7 being the operative book that we're talking about today. Our second panelist, who I hope will be joining us, the Honorable Petros Doukas, is the sitting mayor of Sparta as of 2019. He has a distinguished record of public service in Greece, having served as a member of parliament for the region of Attica, and also as Deputy Minister of Finance for Greece and Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for Greece. His career in finance is also long. He holds an MBA from Columbia and a PhD in economics from NYU here in New York City, where I am. And he's held executive positions or served on boards, both in Greece and in the US, for Citibank, Ericsson, PepsiCo, and so on. Somehow, amid all that, he has also had time to write histories of ancient Greece, including Economic Theories, Principles of Management, and Ancient Greek Thought. And more recently, The Rise and Fall of the Ancient Democracies of Sparta and Athens, Lessons for Today. Jennifer Roberts is Professor of History and Classics and Executive Officer of the Classics Department at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, as you know, as was just said. She's the author of many books and articles, including Accountability in Athenian Government, Athens on Trial, the Anti-Democratic Tradition in Western Thought, and Herodotus, a very short introduction, which is part of that wonderful series from Oxford University Press that we probably all know about. She also co-edited the Norton critical editions of Herodotus and of Thucydides. Most recently, the author of The Plague of War. That word is really difficult right now, but The Plague of War, Athens, Sparta, and the Struggle for Ancient Greece, published by Oxford University Press. Professor Roberts is also a past president of the Association of Ancient Historians. Finally, Barry Strauss, as Lou just said, is the Bryce and Edith M. Bowmar Professor of Humanistic Studies at Cornell University. Once again, we have this long list of publications in front of us, which have to be abbreviated in the interest of time. For starters, I'll highlight his Battle of Salamis, the naval encounter that saved Greece and Western civilization, which was named a best book of 2004 by the Washington Post. There has also been Masters of Command, Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, and the Genius of Leadership, which was counted as a best book in 2012 at Bloomberg. And last year, and we'll forgive these forays into Roman history this afternoon, but most recently last year was 10 Caesars, Roman emperors from Augustus to Constantine, which was hailed by the Wall Street Journal, among other places. Professor Strauss also has a podcast, which I think my students will be interested in, and everybody and many others, called Antiquitas, Leaders and Legends of the Ancient World, which is available on iTunes and Google Play and other platforms. I could go on, but we don't have time. We don't have all afternoon to do this, or all evening, as it were in Greece. I'll just end my introduction of Professor Strauss with, I think, what must be the true feather in his cap, which is that he was declared an honorary citizen of Salamis who gets that from their scholarship? So welcome to all speakers. Let's get started. Professor Strauss, why don't we start with you? And I hope the speakers feel free to join in as they see fit, and hopefully Mayor Doukas will be with us before long. I think, most people, the audience for this might be somewhat self-selecting. People are already aware of the basic outline of the battles of 480 BCE. But maybe as a way of getting started, maybe set the table, give us a sense of how precarious the situation was for Greece as this summer bled into the fall in 480. What were the Persians wanting to do? What were they expecting to accomplish? And how surprising was this moment for the Greek world and maybe the wider Mediterranean? So. Sure. And I think Mayor Doukas is joining us now. So let me do that introduction over again, starting from the beginning. No, I'm kidding. So why don't we just get started? Yeah, so Barry, what do you think about introducing 480?
Sure. Well, thank you, Professor Allen, for that very generous introduction. And I'm happy to introduce 480. Let me just turn my Outlook off, which I forgot to do. Sorry about that. Okay, cool. So, there's an inscription that Corinthians put up after the Battle of Salamis, after the events of 480 and 479, saying that Greece was balanced on a razor's edge. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. Maybe to put it in more contemporary terms, anachronistic terms, for the Greeks to defeat the Persians, they would have had to play to an inside straight. That's how difficult their situation was. So should I continue or?
Yeah, perhaps Mayor Doukas, if you could mute until you're set up. We see part of you. I think you're almost here.
I'm almost there, I think. Can you hear me
now? We can see you and hear you both. So
great. So great to be with you.
You missed my accolades being showered upon you at the start of this. We've already introduced.
Can we have an encore then? Or I'll start playing it all over again. Actually, I'm in the city of Githyon, right on the water.
Oh, wonderful.
We have another event which I had to attend. So great to be with you.
Well, welcome.
And so much more for such a great occasion.
Yeah, well, we're honored by your presence. So thank you for making
the honor is all mine.
And so we were just getting started with Professor Strauss was starting to talk about the battles for us. So yeah, so let's get back to it.
Just please hear that.
Yeah, I welcome, Mr. Mayor. And I was just saying how precarious the situation was for Greece in the summer of 480 BC. Persia was the largest empire in the world. In fact, it was the largest empire that the world had ever seen up to that date. We don't really know the population of the world then, but it's a pretty reasonable estimate to say that something like 1/5 of humanity lived in the Persian Empire. So it was enormous. Greece was a collection of hundreds of independent and often quarreling city-states. It was a real challenge for the Greeks to face the thought of the Persian threat, particularly because the vast majority of Greek city-states either stayed out of it altogether or joined Persia. Only a minority of Greek city-states joined the resistance against the Persians. The Hellenic League led by Athens and Sparta, and it was their job to stop the Persians. What did the Persians want to do? Very simply, they wanted to conquer Greece. They wanted the Greek city-states to submit to their rule. They particularly wanted to punish Athens because Athens had led an attack on the Persian Empire back in 499 BC, when the Greeks along the Aegean coast, the eastern Aegean coast, had revolted against the Persians. The Athenians had marched inland, attacked the Persian provincial capital of Sardis, and had been responsible for burning a temple to the ground. And the Persians had tried to gain revenge on the Athenians at Marathon in 490 and had been thoroughly defeated and humiliated. So 480 marked the return of the Persians and their attempt to avenge their defeat at Marathon, as well as the attack on Sardis. The Persian expedition was enormous. It was led by the Persian king Xerxes himself. All of his prestige was on the line. It was a joint land and naval expedition. The Persian fleet had well over 1,000 warships. The Persian army, in spite of inflation in the accounts of ancient sources, probably about 150,000 soldiers in the Persian army. In addition, enormous logistical support, both of merchant ships and of pack animals, camp followers. Furthermore, the Persians had actually built a canal. They had dug a canal in northern Greece, the Athos Peninsula, in order to allow their navy to pass through there without being exposed to storms. It was a tremendous expedition. They'd also, of course, bridged the Hellespont to allow their men to march across the Hellespont. All of this was not just for show. It was meant to intimidate the Greeks into surrendering to the Persians before they actually fought. Persians fought a very sophisticated way of war. The Persians were capable of amassing huge numbers to defeat their enemy. Their preference, however, was to outthink the enemy, to intimidate the enemy, and to encourage traitors among the enemy to surrender the enemy's resources before the battle. That indeed is how the Persians had put down the revolt of the Greeks along the eastern Aegean coast, the Ionian Revolt, by suborning treachery within the Greek fleet. And that was what they were hoping to do in 480 BC, to get enough Greeks to go over to their side so that it wouldn't be necessary for them to engage in an inordinate amount of fighting. They were willing to fight if necessary, but they preferred not to. The Greeks, from their point of view, how could they have expected to stand up to such a threat? Not entirely ridiculous for them to expect to do so. For one thing, Persia had not had a good track record in recent years in expanding its empire. The Persians had been defeated in an attempt to conquer the Scythians on the northern coast of the Black Sea. That had been a big bust for the Persian Empire. The Persians had they had conquered Egypt, but then had to face a very serious rebellion in Egypt at the other end, western end of their empire. They had had to deal with the Ionian Revolt. And of course, they had failed at Marathon against the Athenians. The Greeks knew that it was not an easy thing for the Persians to project power so far abroad. The Greeks also knew that in spite of the strengths of the Persian Empire, the Greek phalanx, the Greek massed infantry unit, was unmatched in its ability in a set battle. The Persians were not able to compete with this, and they had nothing in their military that could match the Greek heavy armed troops. The one thing the Greeks didn't have as they contemplated the thought of a Persian invasion is they didn't have a state-of-the-art navy that could match the Persians. And so in order to be able to compete with the Persians, they built the navy. Now that sounds easy. You need a navy, you build a navy. In fact, it's extremely difficult. Navies are very, very expensive. And in order to build a navy, the Greeks had to convince their own people to put the resources into building a navy. The greatest military power in Greece at the time was Sparta. But Sparta was a land power. And although there were some within the Spartan elite who wanted to turn to the sea, they wanted to use, in fact, Githion, where you are, Mr. Mayor. They wanted that to be their port. They were a minority within the Spartan regime. and unable to win the day. The only hope for Greece was that another state would build a navy. Corinth might have been a possibility. Corinth had a naval presence, but in fact, the one state in Greece that had the energy, the dynamism, the intelligence, and as it turned out, the resources, the wealth to do it was Athens. Athens had become a democracy in a revolution about 30 years earlier. And as a democracy, Athens was an exceptionally dynamic and public-spirited place. And so, when in the year 483, the Athenians discovered a rich lode of silver in the silver mines that existed in the southern part of Attica, the southern part of Athenian territory, the Democratic Assembly decided what to do with it. And there were those in the state who wanted to use this to essentially give we would say a welfare payment to every citizen of Athens. And this was a popular point of view. But there was another point of view that was championed by an Athenian politician named Themistocles. Themistocles had fought at Marathon. Themistocles was very far-sighted and he understood what the Persian threat was. He persuaded the Athenians that Marathon had not been a decisive victory, that the Persians were likely to return, and that the only way to defeat the Persians was to add to the Spartan infantry superiority a fleet, a modern fleet. And so to use the wealth of the silver mine not to benefit every Athenian citizen individually, but rather to benefit the state as a whole in building a navy. And that's what the Athenians decided to do. In addition to that, Themistocles had a radical plan as to how to defeat the Persians. And that radical plan involved luring the Persians into fighting a battle in the narrow straits between Attica and the island of Salamis, a place that's within view, within sight from the Athenian Acropolis, and that at its narrowest is only about 1.5 miles away from the coast of Attica. He also planned to convince every man, woman, and child to leave Attica and to go into temporary exile while the Persians invaded their state. It was a tremendously ambitious and politically enormously difficult plan to carry out. And it is a tribute to Themistocles' acumen and his skill that he was able to do just that. Professor Allen, is that the kind of introduction that you had in mind?
Sure, that's great. I think we have a lot to get us started with there. I think I'm curious about when you said that you mentioned that the Persians preferred not to fight if it could be done,
right.
You know, if they could move without that.
Right.
Do you think the Greeks knew that? They
Yes.
were fully aware of that Persian reluctance to fight, and that maybe that played a role in Thermopylae? Why Thermopylae? You know, I know we moved into Salamis. Right. You're a citizen of Salamis, so you know.
Yes, my patrida. I have to defend it. But the purpose of Thermopylae was an attempt to stop the Persians in central Greece before they ever got near Athens and Sparta. Thermopylae was a narrow pass, a very narrow pass. And the Greeks felt that it would be possible to stop the Persian army there with a very small Greek force, taking advantage of the terrain. And they were quite successful. As you know, they held the Persians up for 3 days and inflicted very heavy casualties on the Persians. The problem for the Greeks is that the Persians were able to find a traitor. In the area who was able to show them a way around the pass. There was, in fact, a mountain trail that would allow the Persian army to get it to the southern side of the pass and cut the Greeks off. And that ruined the Greek plan to hold the Persians up. They weren't able to maintain that. They either had to flee or to fight to the last man. And of course, famously, the Spartans chose to fight to the last man. There were 300 Spartans there, and I should say, to almost the last man, 298 of them died fighting, including the Spartan king Leonidas. It wasn't meant to be a suicide mission. At least we don't think it was meant to be a suicide mission. It was thought that they had a chance of success. It was certainly seen to be very risky, which is why the Spartans did not want to send a major expeditionary force up to the north. They reserved most of their army in the south. And yet, by the same token, from what Herodotus tells us, the king was prepared to die. He was prepared to die because an oracle said that to save Greece, a king of Sparta had to die. And King Leonidas was willing to do it. Herodotus says that he did it in order to assure his fame and in order to assure his glory, as well as to save his city. There are other more prosaic explanations that have been offered, saying, well, they meant to escape, but they just weren't able to. It didn't work out the way they planned, and they got caught, so they had to fight and die to the last man. Certainly, I prefer to believe that it was a conscious decision. And it had a huge psychological, a beneficial psychological impact on Greece. It galvanized Greek public opinion to fight.
Yeah, you mentioned Herodotus tells us this, all of this, and Herodotus is our source, you know, and it is overwhelmingly favorable to Sparta. Do you think, this is for any panelist, do you see this as an attempt to turn a defeat into a victory by our author Herodotus? What about the memory of Thermopylae? I know that I'm a Roman historian, my research is, I know that Plutarch, living in the Roman Empire, had a very low opinion of Herodotus' account of the Thebans at Thermopylae. But what do you think about the afterlife of Thermopylae, what it meant to the Greeks in the generation that came after? Maybe Jenny, if you want to answer that, or I hate to call on you, but you know.
Sure. So you mentioned my guy, Herodotus. If this were not in Zoom, but if it were live, I would be wearing my Herodotus mask. Here, the actual father of history here, Herodotus. And you two can get one from Redbubble. Yes, okay, yes.
Right. I have a fan of Post-it notes around my Herodotus at all times.
Yes, indeed. You know, Herodotus is a fascinating guy. He's been called the father of history and the father of lies. Some people have tried to say, well, yes, he's the father of history because he gave birth to Thucydides and Thucydides for history, which I don't think is very fair to my guy, Herodotus. But Herodotus was a small child when Xerxes was defeated. And at some point when he was growing up, evidently he heard a lot about the war and said, I think there's a book in this. We'd been raised on Homer and knew that a war story sold. So he decided to write a book, and he speculated about the causes of war, but not just the causes of war, but also the nature of the human condition. And two things struck him about the human condition. One was the centrality of freedom, the importance of freedom to a good human life, and the force of custom. And he uses his account of the war to highlight these two things. He says some good things about the Persians, that they were taught three things: Persian boys, to ride, to shoot straight, to tell the truth. But he also portrays the Persians as hopelessly divided from the Greeks by their inability to understand freedom. And Thermopylae became, for Greeks and for many people afterwards, a symbol of defense of freedom. Persian kings tended to regard all of their subjects, including their relatives, as slaves. And the Greeks thought of Persia as a place where everyone was a slave except the king, and they didn't care for that. He likes to put conversations in his history he, of course, never heard, but a little imaginative, poetic license. He tells one story about two Greeks who fall into the power of the Persian commander Hydarnes. And Hydarnes said, listen, guys, why don't you just defect to Xerxes and he'll give you a nice chunk of Greece to govern. And of course, the Greeks are not interested. And I'll read this in the wonderful translation of my CUNY colleague, Walter Blocko. I did edit this book, but Walter did the translation, and I take no credit for it. And the Greeks say to Hydarnes, the advice you give us is one-sided because you have full experience of what you advise, but none whatever its alternative. You know perfectly well what it is to be a slave, but you know nothing of freedom, of how sweet it is. If you did, you would advise us to fight for it, not only with spears, but hand to hand, with axes. And he also has a wonderful story about the conversation between Xerxes and the exiled Spartan king Demaratus, who is the voice of the Greek value system. And as he's about to an attack, he says to Demaratus, are these Greeks really going to stand up to me? I mean, get real, they're totally outnumbered. How can this happen? And besides, he says, how are men who are all equally free and not ruled by one man, how can they stand up to an army this size? He says it would be different if they were ruled by one man, but with free will, how could they possibly stand up? Well, says Emeritus. He says, fighting one at a time, they are as good as any other man. But when they fight together, they are the best in the world, because though they're free, and this is the punchline, violins, the background, cue the violins, because though they're free, they're not totally free. Custom, law, nomos is the word. Nomos is the despot that stands over them, and they secretly fear it more than their people fear you. They do whatever it commands, and its command is always the same, not to run away from any force, however large, but to stay in formation and either prevail or die. And Herodotus very strongly suggests that the Greek victory was a victory for Greek values. You heard from Barry the story of what happened at Thermopylae. It was immediately memorialized, we think, by Hellenic Simonides, we're not sure, by an epitaph for the people who died there. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their commands, we lie. And so Thermopylae became a legend in its own time, a story of courage and patriotism and sacrifice, and it embodied the technical defeat that was, as we've been saying, a moral victory. And it was very much picked up throughout the rest of history. In 1737, 25-year-old British poet Richard Glover published his poem, Leonidas, which for a while was actually the most popular poem in the English language. I'd heard that it was dreadful. I don't find it actually so dreadful. I read it this week. It didn't seem so bad to me. But in his case, Leonidas was a martyr, possessed of boundless virtue.
Και μου λέει ότι έχω κακό σήμα, σταματάει κάτι.
Sorry. That's good. Maybe. Okay, back. Yeah, sorry, Jenny. Go on.
No, that was fine. The poem closes with its hero's death. The last thing Leonidas sees before he dies is his own wounds. And he says these are the sacred pledges of his own renown and Sparta's safety, and they fill him with joy. And Glover says, fate lays him now in honorable rest to seal his country's liberty in death. And throughout the 18th century, and then the 19th, the motif of Leonidas and Thermopylae was used in support of the Greek Revolution from Turkish domination. The most famous line here, of course, is from Byron's Isles of Greece. Must we but blush your days more blessed? Earth render back from out thy breast a remnant of our Spartan dead. Of the 300, grant but 3 to make a new Thermopylae. And the motif persisted, it actually, across the Atlantic as well. About 3 years, I guess, after the Greeks finally won their independence, American settlers north of the Rio Grande decided that they wanted to rebel from the Mexican government of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And one of the battles of that rebellion has become extraordinarily famous, the unsuccessful defense of the Alamo by maybe 200 American soldiers against 4,000 of Santa Anna's men. And the failed defense of the Alamo was rife with Thermopylae echoes. It was also rife with the motif of freedom. The legend has it that General William Barrett Travis drew a line in the ground and said, something like that. Those prepared to give their lives in freedom's cause, come over to me. And the newspaper in nearby Nagadoches proclaimed, Thermopylae is no longer without a parallel. And when time shall consecrate the dead of the Alamo, Travis and his companions will be named in rivalry with Leonidas and his Spartan band. And Travis did become famous. In fact, my son and his family live now in Travis County, which is named for him. Over 100 years later, a movie appeared, 1978. It's called Go Tell the Spartans, and it comes from the Simonides epitaph from the Thermopylae dead. It stars Burt Lancaster, and I often show this film in my class on classical themes of film, and most of my students have no idea who Burt Lancaster is. And when I showed them the Odyssey with Kirk Douglas, one of them said, "Is that Michael Douglas' father?" So this film, Go Tell the Spartans, it's just marvelous. I love it. And the title, of course, points the way Spartan motifs provide the underpinnings for the film's treatment of heroism. It's the charge of some American forces in Vietnam to defend a little outpost called Mok Hua. And the French had also tried to hold Mok Hua, and that hadn't gone so well for them. So there's an idealistic young draftee in Mok Hua. He's looking up at an epitaph over the French graveyard, and he knows French, and he knows history. And the fellow standing next to him asks him, he says, "Well, sir, if you know your Greek history, sir," of course, the sir does not. And he says, it refers to the Battle of Thermopylae, and he tells him about it. And he's told to go count the graves to see if there are indeed 300, and there are. When it's become clear that they're fighting a losing battle, and it's just not possible, the very cynical Burt Lancaster, who is resentful of his young, youthful recruit's idealism, prepares to evacuate. And he jeers at the kid. "I know what you are. You're a hero." And he adds some expletives that I won't repeat here. But we see the plane take off, and then we see Burt Lancaster still sitting there with his men. And he can't bring himself to go to safety. He dies himself as when we last see him, when the fighting is over, his body is face down in the mud. He is stripped of his uniform, but also stripped of his cynicism. And the image of his naked corpse really embodies Spartan ideals of heroism and self-sacrifice. Now, the war the Americans were fighting was a lost cause. By the time the film was made, President Richard Nixon had brought the soldiers home from the killing fields. But the wars with Persia were not a lost cause. In the end, the Greeks did win, and it was in no small part thanks to the holding operation of Leonidas and his men in the north that slowed down Xerxes' march on Greece and gave the Greeks time to regroup. And along the same lines, the sacrifice made by the Alamo defenders was one factor in spurring their fellow soldiers to victory 46 days later at the Battle of San Jacinto, which led to the establishment of the Republic of Texas under the presidency of General Sam Houston. So really, as long as people fight for their freedom to live under the rule of law, I think Thermopylae is always going to be with us. So it meant a great deal to the Greeks at the time. It encouraged them to feel that resistance against Persia was not futile, and it's encouraged many people since.
And what about that? That's thank you, Jenny. That's wonderful. I mean, what about that, Chris Carey? This idea that we all know that classical Greece wouldn't have happened without these victories, and maybe we can count Thermopylae as a victory along with Salamis. But so it's Greece may logistically survive, but is there more to it? Is there like a psychological boost, or how does the memory of the Persian Wars unfold in the rest of the 5th century BC? Does it sort of assist as giving it this kind of launching pad from which the accomplishment grows? I don't know how it appears in the orators and in Athenian culture, Spartan culture thereafter.
So shall I jump in?
Sure,
at that point?
sure, please do.
Okay, yeah. I think Barry very lucidly, I think, gave a sense of just what kind of an existential threat the Persian Wars are for Greece. And the Greeks were well aware of that. They had survived against really phenomenal odds. And the Greeks immediately start to memorialize and celebrate. They're aware that this is a defining moment in Greek history and in Greek culture. Collectively, they set up memorials at all of the major shrines. At Delphi, they set up a serpent column which had all the names of the participating states in the liberation movement inscribed on it. And in fact, the serpent column still survives. It was taken by Constantine to his new capital at Byzantium. And it still sits there in Istanbul, so it still exists. So the Greeks collectively felt that they had achieved something really quite remarkable. And it is, in a sense, I think, a major step in the definition of what it means to be Greek. But of course, there are two places in particular which have a good war, and they are Athens and Sparta. Sparta, of course, is the leading state in Greece before the beginning of the wars, and they were the natural state to lead the coalition against Persia. But the Athenians, of course, for the reasons that Barry gave, because they had a navy which complemented the Spartan superiority on land, were responsible for a major part of the success against the Persians. And so for each of them, it defines their identity over the next 2 centuries, and it identifies the shape of the Greek world in the 5th century, in the 4th century, and of course it defines the continuing relationship between Greece and Persia right the way through to the point when Alexander invades the Persian Empire and substitutes Greek power for Persian power in Anatolia. The Athenians, you mentioned the orators, Joel, and the Athenians, because they are, of course, a culture of the word as well as a culture of the deed, have many ways of celebrating their success. For them, the success at Salamis becomes one of the ways in which they define Athens' role in Greece. It becomes one of the ways in which they define their right to exercise power in Greece. It becomes a major pillar in the justification of the growth of the Athenian Empire. And whenever the Athenians speak to themselves about Athens, they keep coming back again and again, in particular to Salamis. And the orators throughout the 5th and the 4th century, whenever there are major public speeches, moments of ceremonial and display, they always return to the narrative of the Persian Wars as being part of the definition of Athens as the rescuer of Greece and the bulwark of Greek freedom. So the Athenians are memorializing their own particular role from very early on. But of course, the Athenians have, as well as their oratory, they have one major cultural asset, which no other Greek city really has at this stage, and that is they are the creators of tragedy. And one of the things they do is they use the theatre to celebrate the Athenian role in the liberation of Greece. Most famously, in 472 BC, Aeschylus's play The Persian was staged, which takes as its theme Salamis, but rather strangely doesn't actually look at Salamis from Greece. It takes us a couple of 1,000 kilometers away, and it places us in the Persian court. And so we wait with the Persians for the return of the victorious king, which of course will never happen. We learn during the play that the fleet has been destroyed at Salamis, and the Persian king eventually enters in rags. And so what you have there is a wonderful civic display of the glory of the Athenian achievement. But it goes beyond, I think, the simple nationalist tub thumping, because one of the things that I think makes that place so remarkable is that they understand the Persians. There is a big emphasis on Persian luxury versus Greek simplicity, on Persian autocracy versus Greek freedom, as Jennifer rightly said. The Persian queen asks, how can they fight when they're not subject to one man? And rather like the conversation between Emeritus and the Persian king in Herodotus, she's informed that these are slaves of no man. These are free men who fight for freedom. But as well as that, they also show a remarkable understanding of their enemy. And one of the things that I think makes this not just a remarkable piece of ceremony, but also a remarkable piece of world literature, is the way in which you understand that the Persians come to grief, not just because they're Persians, but because they're human beings, and anyone might do that. So Athens, of course, is defined by it. Sparta already, of course, was a leading power in Greece. But I think Thermopylae in particular was wonderful PR for Sparta. It was one of the best things they could have done. The loss of 300 lives must have been a tremendous blow to them. But of course, what they do is they build a legend out of it. Jennifer referred rightly to the inscription at Thermopylae, which of course you can still find there now. Go tell the Spartans passer by that here obedient to their words we lie. The Spartans claim Thermopylae as their place, and Thermopylae, I think, gives the Spartans a boost to their reputation as people who will always stand and die rather than retreat. And of course, that gives them an enormous psychological advantage whenever they find themselves entering a battle with any other state. And of course, Thermopylae generates all of these wonderful legends about Sparta. The anecdotes. The Spartans are famously men who act and don't speak. They like to use the minimum number of words possible to say what they want to do. And there is, of course, the famous anecdote about the Spartan Dionysus, who is told by one of the locals that when the Persian archers fire their arrows, they block out the sun. And Dionysus famously says, that's good news because we'll be fighting in the shade. And that has reverberated throughout history and is still, in fact, it was quoted by Bill Clinton at the memorial for Flight 93 in 2011. So I think it did wonders for the Spartan legend. But you asked rightly, how do people feel about it at the time? And I think Thermopylae in particular leaps into legend immediately. One of the other inscriptions at Thermopylae says, here against 3 million Persians, 4,000 men from the Peloponnese fought. And as Barry said, probably at most 150,000 Persians swept down into Greece, but already within years of the wars, they have become 3 million. And of course, what that gives you is the battle and the wars have this David and Goliath quality to it. The little guy takes on the big guy, and that I think is part of the enormous appeal that Jennifer so lucidly illustrated, that still persists throughout the present.
Yeah, I'm struck by the humor that the sort of cheeky, response to the danger that they face, this idea of fighting in the shade. I'm also reminded of that line from Aeschylus's The Persian, where the Persian queen says, where is this Athens? I've never heard of it before.
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
that's written by an Athenian author as a form of humble bragging. You know,
yes, yeah,
my team, we won anyway, and yeah. So there seems to there's some sort of an indomitability to the spirit when you see humor like that in this celebration as well. And
absolutely.
And of course, you know, there was a production of the Persians that was just staged at Epidavros at Epidaurus that was streamed throughout the world. Well, I guess one of these silver linings, it's not the right way to describe it, but the silver lining of the pandemic. So Mayor Doukas, if we may, the production at Epidavros, it's not in Sparta, but it's near you. It's in the Peloponnesus. And we're wondering about, you know, modern memories of Thermopylae, how you deal with this, and whether it was your work as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, the memory of Thermopylae, the memory of Salamis, the role as the protector of so-called Western civilization, or even just in your role as mayor of Sparta. You know, how do these wars resonate 2,500 years later?
It's very interesting that it seems that it's still a part of the East-West conflict. We still have this tension between what Herodotus in his first chapter of the histories calls Greece and Europe one thing, and Persia and Asia, now with that Turkey, another thing, a very different thing. And this conflict has been expressed in a number of ways. One is ISIS. We need to dominate you religiously. The other is trying to get more and more land, either be it in the Aegean or the Pacific or what have you. So it's a conflict of cultures. And Xerxes, when his nobles meet and ask about whether it's worthwhile to go after Greece, he says, if we don't do it to them first, they will do it to us. And he had two things in mind so far. One was the invasion of Greeks and destruction of Troy. The other was what you mentioned before, the invasion of Athens and the destruction of Sardis, the capital of Lydia. And he was correct in that sense, because we had two Greek invasions after the Persian Wars. One was by the king of Sparta, Agesilaus, who was really very triumphant in liberating cities in Asia Minor. And the next one was from the Alexander the Great. So we have this thing still coming back virtually to haunt us. Now, it's also very interesting that Sparta was the dominant power in Greece. When the Ionians came to Greece to ask for help around 546 before Christ, they went to Sparta. They did not go to Athens. They said, you are the Spartans, you save us. And of course, the Spartans said no. 30 years later, an embassy from the Scythians, those peoples that were northern of Thrace, came, and they came to Sparta again to ask for help to invade Persia, because Persia was a menacing power. And they said, we will go from the north and you Spartans attack them from the south. That was around 513 before Christ. And the Spartans again said no. 500 before Christ, Aristagoras, the tyrant of Miletus, again goes to Sparta and tries to convince them. And King Cleomenes asked him, how far is the capital of Persia from the coast of Asia Minor? And Aristagoras was surprised. He didn't have time to find some sort of lie to entice the Spartans. And he said the truth, it's about 3 months. So Cleomenes said, get out of here. We're not going to waste any time in such a long expedition. This is not the thing for Sparta. But still, all the Greeks felt that it was Sparta and not Athens, the liberator, the protector of Greek rights. And even though Spartans, as mentioned before, did not have a major navy, the demand from the other Greek cities was for a Spartan admiral. Themistocles was better than Evriviadis in Artemisium and Salamis, but the Greeks didn't want him. They didn't trust the Athenians. They trusted a Spartan admiral, even though Sparta wasn't a sea power. And that was very, very interesting. And when they went to Sicily to ask for help from the Sicily states and the tyrant of Syracuse, and he said, okay, I'll really put in major forces, but I have to be the general. everybody from the embassy said, "You got to be kidding! The Spartans are the top honchos here. He cannot be the head of the army." He said, "Then okay, then make me head of the navy, and I'll send a big naval force." And then the Athenians stepped in. They said, if the Spartans don't want to lead the navy, then we will lead. Which means they also thought that the Spartans are really the leaders also of the navy. And only if the Spartans didn't want that, then the Athenians could take over. So it's very, very interesting what happened at the time. And it's very also interesting to note that King Leonidas and the 300 were the product of Lycurgus. If it wasn't for the Spartan agogi, the Spartan training of young people, you wouldn't have had Leonidas. If it wasn't for the Spartan state, you wouldn't have had Thermopylae. And when much later the Achaeans defeated the Spartans, the first thing that the Victor Philippimon did was to do away with the agogi, the Spartan free training of young people, because that was what was cultivating a flame in the Spartan soul that allowed them to be leaders of all the Greeks. So you have a number of things that just very, very nicely connect together. And it was Lycurgus who I think should be credited with what happened all the centuries after, because Sparta was the first Republican type state. Even though it had a constitutional monarchy, it allowed, unlike Athens, all the parts of Spartan society to participate. The very aristocrats through the kings, the very rich through the Senate, the people through the General Assembly of the Apella, and through the 5 ephors, who were really all powerful and were very probably elected by ballot rather than by lot, rather than by ballot. So everybody felt it was an act of God if you were elected rather than myself. So all these things very, very tightly connects together. And Leonidas, I think, was fully aware of what was going on and what his fate was going to be. Even though, as you rightly pointed out, it was not a suicide mission, he knew he was going to get killed. He knew the prophecy of the oracle, either Sparta goes or its king dies. When he left Sparta and his wife asked him, "What do you want me to do while you're away?" He said, "Find a good Spartan and have good kids with him." And again, when he was going away and marching away with his 300, people were asking him, "Hey, there, you don't have enough soldiers. What are you going to do?" And he said, "For the kind of thing I'm going to Thermopylae, I have more than enough soldiers," because he meant we're going to go to the Lake Xerxes and die there. So he was fully aware. And it's very, very interesting, according to Diodorus Siculus, that the last day of the battles, when he knew that the Idarnis troops were coming behind him through this strange bypass that the Persians, through the traitor, had discovered, then he ordered a full attack of the remaining forces, which according to Diodorus were about 500 only left. Many of them must have been also injured, to fully attack the Persian camp. So the last day of Leonidas, he orders a full attack. He even goes up to the point of capturing Xerxes' major tent, but Xerxes had escaped. Of course, people saw that there were only a few and half of them were really injured, and they went down and killed each and every one of the remaining Spartans and Thespians. And as you pointed out, it was clear that Leonidas knew what was going on. He knew he was going to die, and he knew that he was earning glory for himself, the 300s, and for Sparta. And in the morning before he died, he said, have your first meal because we're dining at Hades, which is, I think, a very, very beautiful expression to put it So still, this thing is very, very particular. For example, we Greeks feel it is very, very well connected with the Turkish expansion in the Aegean. So in our mind, what Leonidas did then and how Greece became a pillar of Europe versus Asian expansion, today we also feel that Greece is a pillar against Turkish and other possible expansions, including religious, ideological expansions.
Yeah, so
but here we are to solve problems.
You know, these symbols are very powerful, and as you did such a good job of articulating the full extent of the Spartan legend of glory and self-sacrifice. But we've also heard from fellow panelists about the Athenians doing something very similar. Is there an irony in all this, that the memory of the Persian Wars is like what catapulted the Greek world to ultimately the Peloponnesian War? I mean, if Salamis, the victory over the Persians by the Athenians, leads to their naval empire, and the sacrifice that the Spartans counter with in stories of Thermopylae, you get this sort of dueling resentments as Athenian naval power grows and begins to operate, you know, disregarding Spartan authority and Spartan reputation.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
That it seems, from what I have read, that the Spartans really tried to delay the Peloponnesian War. And from various sources, it appears that it was Pericles that went asking for it. You know, he was much more belligerent, including writing from Thucydides, and who said that Pericles really prohibited Athenians from discussing sort of peace treaties with the Spartans, and pretty much saying no to all Spartan demands, maybe because he felt that there were economic scandals at the time and a war could solve these things. It's a very, very tricky question, but as Spartans, we feel it was the Athenians who started the whole thing, and King Archidamos of Sparta really said it's crazy to go into a war.
But let me point out something. You're a former member of parliament for the region of Attica. How do you, Mayor Doukas, navigate this in the 21st century with these dueling identities as Attica?
Our guide is the truth. So it seems that was the case, and it has never really been refuted. Athens was becoming an arrogant power, and most Greek city-states felt that Athens was really a bully. Look what happened in the Melian dialogue that so eloquently Thucydides described. And most cities came to Sparta to liberate them from Athens, who was taxing them heavily, unlike Sparta, that they really didn't tax the allies. And not only that, they were really discussing things every time they had a conference. I mean, the Corinthians and other states were really giving help to the Spartans, who listened. And it seems that they were a more open mind, even though inside their society was very, very closed and not the typical modern society. They were open to hear arguments from various parts. Athenians were more imperial, and possibly that was because the lower classes were hungry for power. You know, once you were oppressed within your own state, it's nice to become the oppressor in other states. You know, go out, fetch taxes so you can pay various benefits to the lower classes of Athens and what have you. Pericles was the first to institute a salary for sailors and training of sailors. And then they started saying, okay, there is money here, there's money from the Delian League. Let's start distributing it. And then the appetites opened. They did the Sicily expedition, for which there was really no reason to do it. It was a crazy expedition, and then they were doing maps of Carthage to go and invade Carthage on the other side of the Mediterranean. Then, to me, one explanation is that the masses wanted to liberate themselves and become masters of other places. So I would tend to think that Athens was a bit of a troublemaker because the appetites were more whetted, whereas the Spartan political system was more of a republican system. Each class had a stake, the rich, the poor, the king. So that's why the system, according to the historians, lasted pretty much unchanged for 600 years, whereas Aristotle said within 50 years you had around 15 changes in the Athenian constitution and in the Athenian political system. It was much more unstable and much more prone to civil war. So a lot of Athenians got killed, not by the Spartans, but by various factions.
Mayor Doukas, I see Jennifer Roberts wanting to contribute to our discussion. Jenny,
yes.
please.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hello. Athens was the most peaceful state in Greece in the 4th century. Other states were having civil wars right and left. And Diodorus Siculus tells us about umpteen civil wars between the rich and poor in other states. In Athens, you had an extremely peaceful 4th century. I'm puzzled that it was the Spartans who were responsible. It was the Athenians, excuse me, who were responsible for the war. I seem to remember that Sparta declared war on Athens. That's somehow how I understood it. I fully do blame Pericles' imperialism for much of the war. Pericles is not my hero. He may have been Thucydides' hero. He was Thucydides' hero. He's not my hero, nor is Thucydides, who does not tell us about the speeches that were made against the alliance with Corcyra, against going to war with Sparta. He just said, and some people said other things. But we don't hear about that. So I place a lot of the blame on Pericles. But it's not clear that the Athenians of the 440s and the 430s were the same Athenians as the Athenians of the Melian dialogue and the Sicilian expedition. Obviously, the Melian dialogue paints them in a ghastly light. And I think the Sicilian expedition was a terrible mistake. Some people would disagree. I think it was a big mistake. But it's not clear to me that this was also the Athens against which Sparta went to war. Victor Hansen said something interesting in his book, A War Like No Other. He said that after a certain number of years of fighting, the relationship between the Athenians and the Peloponnesians changed. They now really hated each other. That this had not been the case when the war broke out, but that after a while, tempers had gotten very short. But it's not clear to me that we can overlook the fact that the Spartans did declare war on the Athenians.
That's
Yes,
my friend.
Actually,
I don't think we can celebrate the 2,500th anniversary of the Peloponnesian War for another 60 years. So
We'll be around.
it was the Spartans said we can do away with the treaty we had, but they didn't actually declare war. They just said the treaty we had has ended, and then King Archidamos for 2 years dragged his feet. They absolutely didn't do anything. But it appears that it was the Athenians who constantly broke with the Megarian resolution and what have you. So it seems that they went to Amphipolis, they went to a number of towns, and they started having a very, very big imperial policy, which the other cities very, very heavily complained to the Spartans about. But anyhow, it's not a problem we can resolve now. But I'm writing actually a little memo as to who started the war, and it appears that the ancient historians themselves feel that it was really Athens to blame rather than Sparta. Sparta was much more revered in ancient times than Athens was, even though Athens was exceeding in culture and what have you.
For 20 years,
things to offer to the world.
For 20 years in my undergraduate class, we've had a debate over who started the Peloponnesian War, and in 20 years we haven't answered the question yet, which is wonderful.
Will you excuse me for 10 minutes? I have to attend an event for 10 minutes. I'll be right back.
Thank you very much. It was, yes.
I will be back. Thanks.
Chris, were you going to add something?
I was just going to say that certainly the fact that you have two big players emerging from the Persian Wars, and the fact that one of them does get bigger, that the Athenians grow in power and Sparta feels threatened accordingly, does mean that the Persian Wars, in a sense, precipitate the conflict later in the century. But in a sense, they're just going back to business as usual. As Barry rightly said, before the Persians invaded, the Greeks were squabbling among themselves, and half of them, probably more than half, never actually joined the Greek cause. And after the end of the 5th century and the end of the Peloponnesian War, the Greeks are still fighting among themselves, struggling to see who will actually emerge as the dominant power in Greece. So it's very much a dynamic of Greek life, I think, Greek political life, that they will always fight among themselves. And one of the things Jennifer was talking about Herodotus's narrative, And one of the most striking things about Herodotus's narrative, I think, is the way the Greeks refuse actually to step up collectively. A very small number of them do actually band together, but state after state either go over to Persia or sit on their hands and refuse to fight.
There were over 1,000 states in Greece at that time, maybe as much as 1,500, and 31 went against the Persians. There were more Greeks fighting in Xerxes' navy than there were fighting.
So in that serpent column that Chris Carey mentioned in Istanbul, you see what looks to be this long list of poleis, but actually I wonder if the spectator at the time would have actually seen a very short list. Thought it was not that. Yeah. It's
Joe, I apologize for jumping in, but I will just mention, and then I'll jump out. I will mention that the Spartans had obviously other issues, including controlling their own population, including the Helots, etc. So it became very, very, very difficult for them to expand beyond what they established. And for Athens, it was a little bit different. Even though the Athenians obviously had the medics and all the rest of those who were not Athenian citizens, Sparta had some unique problems which affected its expansion. And with that, I'll jump out.
I think there is something there in this idea of the East versus West dichotomy that is often brought up in reference to the Persian Wars, and has been explored more with Said's work on Orientalism and this tendency to attribute a whole host of kind of nefarious qualities to the other, capital O. That's such a motivating factor in Greek culture. It's not just 480, we're not just celebrating 2,500 years of Thermopylae and Salamis, it's also the Battle of Himera in Sicily, supposedly, the exact same day, as Salamis, where the Greeks of Sicily defeated the Carthaginians of North Africa. What do you all think of that? Any panelists about the Greek need for an other to be a motivating factor in their policies and also in their identity? Is it a problem at all, or is it an unavoidable reality in any culture? Barry, you're muted. I'm sorry, Barry. You're there. Yes.
Don't you want to lip read me? I could lip sync my own talk. The culture, the societies of the ancient Mediterranean were at each other's throats. There were very few, if any, Switzerlands. They were all fighting each other all the time, and it was considered the way to get ahead. So I think competition, violent competition, was inevitable. And the most you could hope for was coming up with ways of limiting it. I don't think it was a need for the other. I think it was simply a competition over resources, over glory, over honor. It was the kind of societies that they were. So that would be my explanation.
In a sense, picking up on Barry's point, in a sense, the Greek sense of the other is exacerbated by the Persian Wars, because the Greeks were very, very happy to work with the Persians against other Greeks. This sense of although the Greeks were well aware of what it meant to be Greek before the Persian Wars, it is a kind of accelerating phenomenon, I think, after the Persian Wars.
We're very, very wedded to the idea of us versus not us. I mean, you have the Athenians with their bizarre autochthony myth that either they were all actually descended from this guy Erythonius who was a snake and he came out of the earth, or they really all in some sense grow out of earth. It's a very bizarre ideology. And for that reason, they're particularly jealous of their citizenship. Well, all Greek states were jealous of their citizenship, but they came up with ridiculous explanations of Athenian versus not Athenian. And then in Sparta, you have the very peculiar tunnel vision that made it impossible for them to see that they really needed to expand their citizen body or they would lose everything. And they wouldn't. They had these people they called neodamodes, who were freed helots, freed slaves, who fought for Sparta. and they were settled on the outskirts, of the Peloponnesus. They were housed in warfare with the full Spartan citizens, at least after the 420s. And yet, when they were liberated, they did not become part of the citizen body. Then there were these people known as the perioiki, the people who lived round about, who provided the pots and pans and shields and swords and the things that the citizens and the Helot slaves did not provide. And it would have been the easiest thing in the world to enfranchise some of them. The Spartans didn't have to think in terms of enfranchising immigrants from islands, from Corinth, from Thebes. They had plenty of people to enfranchise, and they didn't. And it wasn't until Cleomenes the something in the 3rd century who crippled the effort and redistributed the land and expanded the population and built it up to a robust size. But by the end of the Battle of Leuctra in 371, the full Spartan citizen body was something like 400. It had been about 8,000 during the Persian Wars. So they had every reason to see that they had to expand the citizen body, and they wouldn't do it. And I think it's fascinating about the Greeks, that they would not do this. So even within Greece itself, the Greek states had a mixed feeling about Greekness. On the one hand, you have Herodotus saying lovely things like, "Oh no, we could not go over to the Persians because there are all these things that hold us together. To Hellenicon, the Greek thing, our temples, our gods, our language, yada yada." But in fact, God forbid one Greek citizen should become a citizen of another Greek state.
Yeah, there's a strange coexistence of worldliness and parochialism at the same time, I think. And you think about the Greeks sort of turning on the other in their tales of the Persian Wars, but they're turning on the other, but they're also turning on each other. And I keep coming back to Plutarch's account of Thermopylae. His memory of Thermopylae is that Herodotus was deliberately smearing the Thebans, that they were as glorious there as the Spartans. And so Herodotus probably knew that and kind of buried that story in his version of events. So yeah, these momentous wars led not only to this the launching of the classical age for the Greek world, but maybe ironically, the divisions among them get exacerbated. Although, as you point out, they've always been there, but you're sort of dialing it up a notch when you're on a global stage like this. So this is wonderful. Lou, do you have more to add, or can we continue, or what do you?
Well, I think you should continue, because I do want to have a small conversation after this discussion with the mayor of Sparta relating to any activities they're going to be doing around the Battle of Thermopylae. But also next year is the 200th anniversary of the Hellenic Revolution. And I would like to touch on that with the mayor in terms of what's happening in Sparta. I will say that in terms of the discussion, don't forget, a lot of the Greek mercenaries, let's say, were in the Persian areas maybe a couple of hundred years even before these particular battles. So they certainly knew the Persians. The hoplites obviously were mercenaries for all types of empires in the East. And at the same time, many Greeks, including Spartans, were fighting with the Persians. In other words, when the Persian army came into Greece, they weren't all Persians. They were different nationalities, including Greeks, quite frankly. And in the ancient period, I think a lot of this had to do also with defeating the enemy, taking slaves, and then making a lot of money in the process, quite frankly. So please continue the discussion. And when the mayor comes on and when you feel comfortable to end the discussion, I'll just jump into this brief discussion on the events that will be taking place in Sparta.
Sure.
Can I just pick up on Louis' point about making money? When Herodotus talks about about Xerxes marching through Greece, and he has this wonderful slow narrative of this snowball that's coming down slowly to overwhelm Greece. And as Xerxes travels, he press gangs all of these people, the Thracians, the various Greeks from the north, and brings them into his army. But it's always struck me that for many of them, exactly as Louis says, there must have been an enormous appeal in the possibility of plunder, because if you followed the Persians and the Persians won, there must have been a lot to win. I'm not sure that it's all just about ideology or about taking sides. I think sometimes there is rather grimy gain involved as well.
This is something that's always struck me about the Peloponnesian War, that it was predictable that it would be economically unfortunate. It could not be known that it would be as disastrous as it was. Barry has written very beautifully about the impact of war on Athens. No one could have foreseen a war of 27 years. Greeks did not do that. Greeks did wars of 27 minutes. But nonetheless, it could have been foreseen that war is not good for agriculture. It's not good for raising the next generation. It's not good for so many things. And the tremendous disruption that took place in Attica during the war could have been foreseen on a lower level if the war had just gone on for a few years. We can figure out that the Athenians and the Spartans both thought they were looking at a pretty short war. Spartans figured, march into Attica, beat them up. If they don't surrender, march in the second year, beat them up again, they'll give up. The Athenians, of course, figured they'll march in, we won't march out. They'll maybe give up, or they'll march in the second time, we won't march out, they'll give up. But still, the wars are not always profitable. And this one certainly was not profitable for the Athenians. It wasn't profitable.
Peloponnesian War you're talking about.
Excuse me? The Peloponnesian War, absolutely. Sorry. Yes, the Peloponnesian War. So I find it interesting that this war that was not financially advantageous nonetheless seemed to have such appeal, although I suspect not as much appeal as I said, as Thucydides makes it sound like, because he does not reproduce the speeches of those who are opposed.
Can I ask you historians a question? We talk about the Battle of Thermopylae, we talk about the Battle of Salamis. Why don't we talk enough about the Battle of Plataea and Mycale, which basically ended, that Persian War, and actually ended all Persian wars? What took place in Thermopylae and Salamis that did not take place in Plataea and Mycale, which were, the final battles and successful battles?
I think that's a very good question. I think in the serpent column that Chris Carey talked about is about the Battle of Plataea, right? The serpent column remembers that. And I wonder if that was more popular at the time, but it was a collective effort at Plataea, whereas Thermopylae and Salamis, one equaled Sparta and one equals Athens. And in the rivalry between those two states, they get accentuated. Who cares about cooperation that you get at Plataea? There's nothing sexy about that, maybe. That's just my take on it. But
also Xerxes wasn't there anymore, and I think that's tremendously important. The narrative from the Greek point of view is very much the narrative of this rich, arrogant Eastern guy who thinks that money buys everything and that numbers are everything, and he's always counting things. Xerxes, Persians love to count things. Oh, look how much! Look how much! And Xerxes, at a certain point after Salamis, he goes home. And I think that the fact that he's not there anymore takes away a certain drama from the account. I mean, Herodotus gets tremendous drama from everything about this larger-than-life figure Xerxes. There's a wonderful story about Salamis. One of the things that really interested Herodotus, unlike Thucydides, was women. And Herodotus was very interested in smart, capable women with lots of agency. And he tells the story about how one of Xerxes' admirals is a woman, Artemisia. And he says to her, well, there are two stories. One is that she's fighting at Salamis and she's being chased by an Athenian ship. And so she turns around and she rams another Persian ship. And the Athenian captain says, oh my gosh, she's one of us. I didn't realize. And he leaves her alone. And Xerxes has not been pleased with the way his men have been behaving. He says, my men are turned into women and my women are turned into men. And there's another great story about Artemisia that after that battle, there's a question of whether Xerxes should give battle at Salamis. Themistocles wants to trick him into giving battle because Themistocles knows that the Greeks are in danger of cutting and running back each to their own homes. And so Artemisia says, don't fight with them because they're going to go home. That's great. That's exactly what we want. And Xerxes says, that's really great advice, Artemisia. I'm not going to take it, but I want you to know it's really great advice. But he doesn't take it.
So the world's most famous mansplainer goes down in flames, I think.
He does indeed. So I think he's not there anymore. The punch goes out of the narrative.
Yeah, I saw that Barry, I absolutely agree, Jenny. I absolutely agree. And I saw that Barry wanted to comment. I know he has a hard stop at 3:30. So I don't know if you wanted to say something, Barry.
Sure. I was going to say that in answer to the Lou's question, why not Plataea and Mycale, I think it all has to do with public relations. I mean, Herodotus shapes the narrative of the war. For Herodotus, Thermopylae is the heart of the war. No other battle in the book, in his entire book, has the emotional impact that the Battle of Thermopylae does. And he tells the story with exquisite care to pull our heartstrings. But he also says, he makes clear that Salamis is the intellectual explanation of the Greek victory. And he says, many people will disagree with me, but it's the Athenians who made the most contribution to Greece winning the war. So those are his two explanations, Salamis and Thermopylae. Anything else is going to have to be an afterthought and an also-ran. And so I think those are the roles that inevitably, sadly, Plataea and Mycale are reduced to.
And also,
let's have Chris Carey, Jenny.
Please.
Carey, yeah.
I was just going to say, I also think that both Thermopylae and Salamis are campaigns of stunning brilliance, because Thermopylae in particular, they choose their terrain. As Barry said, this is a very narrow pass. At one end, in fact, at each end, it's only a cart width wide, so maybe 20 feet, something like that, as you get into the pass. And what they do, of course, is they choose a terrain where the Persians can't use their cavalry and they can't use their archers. And the Persian tactic that had made them masters of the world was to have their archers pound the enemy relentlessly until the enemy break. And then they move in and finish them off. And what they can't do is what they're not trained to do is to fight heavy armed infantry blow for blow. And the Greeks choose a terrain which allows them to nullify the Persian strengths. And of course, also the Persians outnumber them, God knows how many to one, but they can't deploy their numbers. And so the Spartans, well, the Greeks in the past, not just the Spartans, are stuck like a cork in a bottle. And then at Salamis, again, they trick the Persians into fighting in space, which is very much to their advantage. And it seems to me that they choose their ground absolutely beautifully. And if you can get your enemy to fight on terrain that favors you, and if you can remove all of the advantages that the enemy enjoy, then you're on a winner. I think both of them are beautiful campaigns. Barry knows more than I do, of course, because he's a military historian. But I think they're exquisite battles.
I couldn't say it better than you just did.
I was always fascinated by Plataea, actually, because I agree that there's something elegant about Thermopylae and Salamis, but Plataea had so many complexities, and as a logistical feat, I was more impressed by that almost. But Jenny, you were going to say something. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, I think I was interrupting Chris. No, also both Thermopylae and Salamis involve a trick. At Thermopylae, you have the traitor Ephialtes, who betrays the Greeks and tells Xerxes about the extra And then at Salamis, Themistocles tricked Xerxes into attacking. And that gives it a punch in both cases.
Behind me is the Acropolis. Obviously, it was burned down by the Persians during the period that we're talking about, and when the population, basically left and went into the Battle of Salamis. But in terms of those particular battles, does anyone believe that with the rise of Athens and the building, obviously, of the Acropolis a few decades later, after the period we're talking about, that in fact these particular battles were battles between for the hearts and minds, let's say, of the Hellenic people, and why perhaps Plataea and Mycale were sidelined to a certain degree?
Well, on that's a fascinating question, and I know that my colleagues are going to be up to the task of answering it. I'm very sorry that I have to leave now because of another obligation, but I want to thank you for inviting me to take part in this wonderful panel. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Okay,
Take care, Barry.
Take care now.
Bye, Chris. Bye.
In answer to your question, Lou,
Yeah.
you yourself brought up the fact that that the Greeks encountered, when they went to Persia, they encountered more Greeks.
Correct.
Alexander's biggest problem are Greek mercenaries fighting in Persia when he goes. So I think it's a good point you make about winning over the hearts and minds of the Greeks, via the Persian Wars. So that's all I wanted to add.
All right. We have the mayor of Sparta back with us. I thank you, Joel, Petros, Chris, Jennifer, and Barry for this fantastic and very interesting and insightful discussion of these heroic battles in the 2500th year anniversary. Joel, part of the reason why I mentioned the Acropolis behind me and the burning of the Acropolis at that particular period during the battles, and also obviously the construction of the new Acropolis, the Acropolis that we know, is obvious, and there's a reason for this, why I'm bringing it up, because in the graduate center of City University, you do have, in fact, the castings of the original Acropolis metopes around the perimeter. Could you just give us a little bit of just a slight discussion on that? Because I do want to do an event relating to those particular castings that you have at the university.
Yeah, we have plaster casts of the metopes and the friezes from the Parthenon, and also the pedimental sculptures that are the possession of City College, but are currently loaned to the public spaces of the Grad Center. And when the Athenians depict the myth that they choose to put on their temple is Greeks fighting centaurs, there's no mistake there. What is a centaur? It's a man on horseback, basically, or it's a man in horseback. And what is a Persian but a soldier that fights on horseback? So when you show this battle of Greeks versus centaurs, you're reminding your audience of the war against Persia. Likewise, with the Boardman thesis, anyway, of the metopes with the horse and riders on the continuous frieze, his theory was that there were 193 of these horse and riders, which is the exact number of Athenians that died at the Battle of Marathon. So that's contested, but that just goes to show of all the theories of the interpretations of the Parthenon as a constant reference to Persia, and Athenian victory over Persia. Like they didn't want their audience to forget it.
And you also have the Amazons on the street.
And the war.
The other, the preoccupation with the other. The Amazons were the ultimate other. And the Athenians, there were all kinds of different ways of talking about the Amazons. Herodotus just finds them fascinating and wonderful. He doesn't make them sound horrible at all. But the 4th century Athenian orator Lysias talks about how the Amazons were these terrible imperialists and they had enslaved much of the world, but then the wonderful Athenians made fast work of them. And this is what you see on the Parthenon. So the idea of an Eastern imperial power that is somehow unnatural is embodied in the Amazons on the Parthenon.
Before we end the program, even though I have the Acropolis behind me, I am myself, I hate, I'm not a Trojan horse or anything, but I happen to be from Lacedaemonia. I happen to be a Spartan myself. And we're very pleased to have with us the mayor of Sparta. And if we can, Petro, if you can discuss some of the events that Sparta may have around the Battle of Thermopylae, but also next year is coming the 200th anniversary of the Hellenic Revolution. And if you can, tell us some of the events that are being planned around these occasions.
Well, we're starting, thank you very much, Louis, for getting us all together here. And many thanks to the professors for loving our country and our history and doing so much original work on it.
It's their culture too, and their history also. So thank you again. Thank you again to the panel. Yes.
Now, tomorrow, we are having a major event by our municipal stadium and the statue of King Leonidas. Of course, because of the pandemic, everything has to be pitifully limited. What we're going to do tomorrow is we're going to lay wreaths on the statue of Leonidas. We're going to recite by school children ancient Greek poems by Terpandros and Pyrteos and Alcman and what have you. Then I'm going to have a panegyric a speech for the audience there. And we're going to have Greek Air Force fighters flying over Sparta to honor King Leonidas. The Major of Thespies is also joining us, and the Minister of the Interior is also joining us, and representatives of the Greek Air Force. We're going to have piano recital regarding the Thermopylae event. So it's going to be a nice event followed by fireworks, but again, much more limited in scope. It's Plan D versus the original Plan A. And we will continue with such events. For example, reinstituting the Leonidia, the ancient games in honor of Leonidas, which was for Spartan kids only. And we will reinstitute that. We wanted to do it, but because of all these increases in the pandemic, we said it's better to play it safe with the school kids and let the Ministry of Education take care of that. And then we will continue in this mode. We're planning a major super marathon between Sparta and Thermopylae, non-stop 330 kilometers. And a second one, the return of the glory from Thermopylae to Sparta. We're going to have a lot of Spartan races, and we're also going to commemorate Helen of Troy, which we want to rename Helen
from
of Troy.
Pelana, from Pelana.
From Pelana.
And don't forget, and I'm from Yorgitsi, so Pelana is my district.
Absolutely. And we're going to have a marathon race from Pelana to Hithio, where I'm now, where actually Helen of Troy was abducted. And of course, as Herodotus say, if the woman didn't want to be abducted, she wouldn't allow herself to be abducted. So we're going to have a number of events of this sort. And we're going to have a major event in honor of the first governor of Greece, Kapodistrias. And we're going to have events honoring the participation of Spartan leaders for the revolution of 1821. The extent of these events and the venue of these events, we have to see how the pandemic unfolds. It has really upset all our programming. So as soon as we can take a breath, and it's very, very nice that Sparta and the whole of Laconia is zero COVID for the past 11 months. We had absolutely not a single case. We're trying to keep it that way. But
the virus was afraid of the Lacedaemonians.
It seems so, especially in this 2,500-year anniversary, it got a little scared. But depending on how things with the virus develop, we're going to have major live events of this sort, commemorating Kapodistrias, the first Greek constitution, which was a very avant-garde constitution in the 1820s. It was really something that was amazing in its forward looking. So all of these we're going to try to discuss. We would like to have forum with a real live audience rather than webcast kind of events, because it's good. You meet the people, you talk after them, you share more experiences. But let's see how this pandemic unfolds. For the time being, we're having this nice event tomorrow with the Greek Air Force. more limited events of that sort. We don't want anybody to say that we are the ones that caused the virus to come back to Sparta. And we'll take it from there. And this is a good opportunity for me to issue an invitation to come to Sparta as our guests. We will host you here whenever these events allow us to get on with it. So we have very, very interesting thing. We want to do Sparta a major international sports center, especially for running type of events that don't need huge stadiums or Wembley type stadiums. And we also want to make it a major geopolitical event. We want NATO conferences to happen in Sparta. Why? Because we represent through Thermopylae the Western values versus despotic and tyrannical values. We want to play that and allow people to come and then enjoy trekking a nice weekend, climbing up Mount Taygetos, or having a quick bath on the river Herodotus. So we have a number of plans. We're just very apprehensive with the pandemic. I think it's going to be a bit over the cliff now. I think things are going to start to retard. It's not going to get worse. It's going to get steadily better. As soon as we see that and we are convinced of that from the scientific community, then we'll move way ahead and we'll keep you posted.
Petros, thank you for that. And any way we can help you with regards to some of the events you're having, certainly we want to do it. As a matter of fact, my cousins run in those races that you're talking about, including my female cousins also, in terms of this, what do you call it, the Spartathlon, that long race. Yeah.
Spartathlon is a non-stop race from Athens to Sparta. And then we have the Phidippidian race, which is Athens, Sparta, Athens, again, non-stop. And now we're going to have Sparta, Thermopylae, and what have you.
So a sincere thank you to our panel moderator. Thank you, Joel, and to our panelists today. Please join us for our next panel discussion, which will be next week, entitled The Martyred City, the Smyrna Catastrophe, September 1922, Remembrance of the Christian Hellenic Genocide. Our panelists will include Professor Ismini Lam, the director of the Modern Greek program in the Department of Classics at Georgetown University, Professor Nikos Michailidis in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and Dr. Peter Stavranidis, an educator, community leader in Hellenic genocide issues. Any comments from anyone who was on the panels for today? Any final comments?
It's very interesting that right before the Battle of Platees, the Thebans, who had gone with the Persian side, unfortunately, go to General Mardonius, the Persian general, who Xerxes left behind to finish the job, and they tell him, listen, let me give you a piece of advice. The Greeks united are unbeatable. You cannot beat them as Darius didn't beat them and as Xerxes didn't beat them. What you need to do is cause division amongst them. And one way of causing division is bribing some of the leaders in some of the cities. Cause division between Sparta and Argos, Sparta and Athens. Bribe them and you'll get your way. Mardonius liked to fight, so he didn't follow the Theban advice. And of course, we had the Greek victory in Platees.
Joel, any final words on your end?
I don't. Thank you very much, Lou. This is a great event. Thank you.
Jennifer?
Wonderful idea. Thank you so much for putting this
Chris?
Just one sentence, if I may, and that is, I mentioned that Thermopylae was a great PR victory for Sparta. There were probably about 7,000 Greeks fighting at Thermopylae, and we remember the 300. That is quite a PR victory.
You're absolutely right. And to Petros, words, quite frankly, in terms of uniting, we know many times the Hellenic people are not united. And as a matter of fact, to a certain degree, what happened in the ancient days is almost in the modern days too. We regard ourselves as Spartans, for example, as Petros indicated earlier, versus the Athenians. But united, we cannot be defeated. So thank you again, all of you. And thank you to the audience for listening to us. What is that, Petros?
I'm just taking you a memorial picture.
Hey, thanks to everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
And let's get together again. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Soon.
Thank you. Nasti kala.
Και εσύ επίσης. Thank you so much.
Χρόνια πολλά.
Χρόνια πολλά και σε σένα. Γεια σου. Thank you all.
Yes.